All right, welcome to week number 2 of the Found in Interpretation podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Alain Breton, and I'm here again this week with Brian Bickford. Brian, how are you doing
Hello,
this week?
hello. I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
Well, actually, it was kind of a strange morning for me, if I can just start like that. This morning was the Translation Bureau annual exam. If you want to if you want to get a job or be a subcontractor for the federal government, you need to pass the Translation Bureau test. And this is a test that is basically offered every year. You got to find the date, send your CV. Once you're accepted, then you have to do the test. And I have to admit, this was my third time trying this test. Basically, there are 3 videos. My language combinations are French A, English B, so I have to do two interpretations, 2 English to French, and then 1 French to English. And this morning, I was getting ready. I had my whole setup. When you log in, they want you to show your ID in front of the camera to make sure that it's you. And then the exam begins. It was something from the parliament. It was an MP, an Ontario MP, making a speech at the House of Commons, and it went well. I have experience with parliamentary interpretation. It went well, and actually, as the interpretation was going on, I was happy, and I was like, "Oh yeah, maybe this year I'll nail it." It was great, and I was so happy. And then once it was done, I have to wait 5 minutes for the second video. There's a break,
Hmm. Yeah.
and everything crashes. Boom, nothing, and I was like, "What's going on?" And then the page reloads and it says, "Thank you for completing the exam." And I'm like, "No, I've got 2 more to do." So I reached to tech support and they said, "Yeah, we can't do anything about it. Better luck next time. Show up at the next exam." So I was feel a bit angry because this time technology failed where I think I may not have. So
So you're telling me that their system failed,
yeah,
and
their
then
system failed. Yeah,
and then their
there.
response was like, just better luck next year.
That's right. Well, I mean, they didn't say
Oh,
next year, but they said more like next time because sometimes it's twice a year, sometimes it's every year. I'm not really sure. They're pretty secretive.
yeah,
But anyway, it is what it is. But doesn't mean we're not going to work and we're not going to get better, right?
that's true. And this leads us
Yeah,
perfectly to the next segue for our actual theme for this podcast. So this one we're gonna
that's right.
delve into what it's like to be a newcomer coming in, and what are kind of the things you should look out for when you're starting off in this profession.
Yeah,
So should
exactly. What happens
we?
when shit hits the fan, right?
Yeah, because shit does hit the fan, and fortunately not often, but when it does, you have to be ready. So I think that one of the main things that interpreters need to understand when they first come into an assignment is that they need to have a contract in place with the person who's hiring them. I think that's the
That's
most
right.
important basic thing, and it may seem like common sense, but there's a lot of agencies out there who just rely on email, and they're like, "Here's all the details now. Vaya con Dios. You go and do your job, and God willing, everything goes well." Now, you were telling me, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that somebody had posted something on a chat conversation about an incident that happened to this interpreter.
Yeah, I was reading one of the many forums online where interpreters gather, and I don't want to give any specifics or names here, of course, but basically the gist of the story is that an interpreter was left by himself in the booth because either a mistake by the agent, I'm not sure if it's a mistake by the agency or another interpreter didn't show up. So the
Okay.
interpreter had to sort of hold the fort for a whole day.
The entire day working
The
alone.
entire day. As far as I understand the story, it's for the
Oof.
entire day.
Okay.
So, what's the advice you would give to an interpreter when a situation like this arises?
Well, I think that firstly, that's very brave to be able to take on a full day by yourself. So kudos to that interpreter if they did that. Normally, that's not done in our profession. We do take half-hour breaks in between shifts. When we're working, say, like, with two interpreters, we spell each other off. So, like, we do need to take these breaks so that we can refocus, get our energies back, and deliver a good quality interpretation. This is like this is standard, like it's within the
Yeah.
industry, right? And the fact that this person wasn't able to do that, it could cause a lot of issues. Firstly, if they're online and the sound is not equal for every party who's speaking, then they have to turn their volume up and down, and they could potentially get a loud noise in their ears, which would damage the eardrums. And once your eardrums are damaged, then that's forever. Like there's no real solution for that. So it's important to protect your tools. One of them is being your hearing. So yeah, that would be one of the things that I would point out immediately off the bat.
Yeah,
If it
because
was
there's a big
live
health
too,
issue, right?
yeah, there's a big health issue. Not to mention, years ago, a colleague of mine had told me about this article that he read, where if you keep on interpreting, the longer you go, the more your brain actually physically swells inside your skull.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to the point where
Swells?
yeah, it swells. Like it's like a muscle, right? So like your muscles when they're put to action, like if you're doing like a marathon or
Yeah.
after that, like your muscles like they get all tense and
I
contract and
never heard
everything.
that.
Yeah, yeah. I've been
Fact
trying for
checkers.
years.
I
I
need the
know.
fact checkers right now.
Yeah, do it. We're gonna have to hire a fact checker.
Yeah, we
Anyways,
will. We will.
that'll be
I'm sure
episode
they're going to come by
32.
themselves. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we'll get some comments in the in there at the bottom of our
Please leave a
podcast.
comment below.
Yes, after you like, after hit like and tell us what we did
Please.
wrong. So in any event, yeah. So so that's a huge health issue. But the other thing too is a lot of agencies they don't like to share certain things. So it's important to, like I said, to have this contract because there's a lot of things that you could do to prevent that kind of situation. For instance, when I own UN Language Services, and when I send out contracts, I always put the name of your colleague down. And my assumption is that when I do that and I introduce everyone, that you guys are in touch with one another and you can work together before the contract, so that you know each other's contact information, you know what you've been researching together, and that kind of thing. So a lot of clients think, oh, well, you know what, like this flat rate for an interpreter's daily rate is, um, like that's that's it, like it's only that. I'm like, no, there's a lot of preparation that goes beforehand. So when you're paying an interpreter a flat rate, you're also preparing them to prepare beforehand. Sorry, paying them to prepare beforehand. So they're preparing all of the content, they're all of their material, they're making sure this the web link is working, or like if it's a different address that they've never been to before, that they find it and give themselves enough time to get there on time. But yeah, one of the most important things is the communication with your colleague, because it's important to work as a team. And when you're working as a team, then you have each other's contact information. So if something goes wrong, someone gets a flat tire, it's like, okay, I'll take care of the first bit. I'll wait for you to arrive, and then when just get settled in, and then you can help me after. Now, in the case of this interpreter, it seems like he or she didn't have access to this colleague to see what was happening. Correct me if I'm
Yeah,
wrong, but
actually, I'm not even sure if it was. Maybe I kind of forgot the details here, but I think I'm not sure, but I think it was on site.
okay. On site. So yeah, so
So,
so even more important to have that contact with one another to make sure, like, hey, I'm in the booth. Like, when are you coming?
so,
When are you
but
showing up?
what if you're that interpreter? What if this situation comes about and you're left by yourself for the whole day? Do you suddenly? Well, first of all, you got to tell the agency right away that this is what's going on. The agency's job is to find someone as soon as possible. But if you know they can't find anyone, or it will take a few hours to have people come to the rescue, uh, while you're waiting for the cavalry, what should you do? Should you go 2 or 3 hours on your own? Is that even possible? So what do you do?
Yeah, I guess I don't know what the right answer is, because technically speaking, we could only go 30 minutes and then we have to stop. So I don't know. Like, you also want to make the client happy, right? So there's
Yeah,
that balance where, like, do you have an unsatisfied client, or do you risk them even being unhappy too? Because after half an hour, then the quality starts to go down a bit. So, like, you could do it for a little while, but a full day is a monstrous amount of work. I
yeah,
think, but I think
or
once
even
again,
half
like
a day, even half a day.
yeah, yeah, even half a day, yeah. Like,
Have you
I
ever
mean,
heard
if
of the have you ever heard of different standards depending on which country? Because we're in the French English market in Canada.
yeah,
That may be different than saying that when you find in the United States. One time I was interpreting in New York, and I was part of its French English team. But then there was the Spanish team, and she was surprised because the girl came all the way from. I'm not sure if it was Colombia or Argentina. I think it was more like Argentina. The girl came all the way from Argentina for this special mandate, and she was surprised that my booth. I mean, there was a partner. I had a partner. We were in a meeting, and every 30 minutes, I was leaving the meeting room, and my partner was coming in, and we were just switching. And she did the whole day by herself. She was doing Spanish and English. So, and I was telling her, well, these are this is what's supposed to be. Now, you're not supposed to be on your own for the whole day. So, you've worked, I think, sometimes in America, right? So, do you know if the standards are a bit different if we do have people in the audience who are from America or elsewhere?
yeah. I think Canada, we're pretty lucky because we do have two official languages. So we have had interpretation in our in the government and in private settings, national conferences, etc. We've had that for many, many years. So we do have stricter guidelines in terms of the market and how it operates, as opposed to other countries like the United States, where there's only one official language. So they're, in a lot of ways, are kind of playing catch up. Like, yes, there are international standards, and the international standards are very strict in terms of how many interpreters should work and for how long and that kind of thing, and what are the working conditions, what kind of equipment you should use. It has to be ISO certified, like all this other stuff, right? So I think that unfortunately the countries that are unilingual, like with only one language as their official language, they are playing catch up, and a lot of times they get stuck with those situations where there's like one interpreter, and they have to take on all this extra work, whereas we're not spoiled, but we're respecting the standard. so so we do have
Yeah.
a booth mate, and we can help each other out, and
Well,
that does improve the quality of the service, so, when it comes
well,
down
I
to
guess
it.
I have to thank previous generation of interpreters, the interpreters that came before us, for having established those standards.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And
Like ever since the um, equipment that was required in order to do simultaneous interpretation came about, that was a huge help for starters. But then when people were kind of flabbergasted, like, wow, these people can listen to one language and repeat it in another language, and how does the brain work like that? Like, people didn't believe that this kind of thing worked at times.
yeah,
And so, like, yeah, so then eventually you're like, yes, it does, we can do it, but it does take a lot of mental work to do it, so we do need to take breaks every once in a while. You can't just be on autopilot and do this all day. So yeah, no, it does. Like I said, like, I think these multilingual countries that needed interpretation really were the forefathers of interpretation, and thanks to them, now we have these standards that we need to abide by.
yeah, and that's very important, especially for I think for new interpreters. It would be quite. I think it's essential for new interpreters to actually read those guidelines because you and I have been on the market for a number of years. We know what we should do in case of an emergency, or if a client makes some request that obviously we can't do.
Hmm.
This reminds me, for instance, one time I was, and it's not exactly a similar situation, but it makes it that situation that I read in the forum made me think of something that happened on one of your gigs one time. I don't know if you remember, but Uh,
What did
you
I
set
do?
me up for no, actually, you set me up for a very short gig for one presentation here in Quebec City,
Hmm.
and then the client comes to see me, the organizer, and because it was like a huge meeting, like there were like maybe 500 people in le Congress, le Centre des Congrès de Québec.
Hmm.
And then she came to see me and says, "Okay, well, you're booked between 10 and 11, but at 11:15, could you go into that booth over there? And at noon, can you go into that booth?" And I was like, "I'm sorry, but first of all, that was not in my contract. And second, please contact my agency."
Yes.
And usually I would be the kind of guy who, could stretch a little bit or try to do a favor or try to be the nice guy or anything. But in those situations, when the client, it's not that you're mean with the client. I think it's just that the client doesn't really know what your work is. They don't know. So you have sometimes to educate the client to tell them these are the standards of the industry. And when there's an issue, the reason why there's an agency and you don't deal with 10 interpreters at the same, with 10 different contracts and 10 different issues and everything, is because you have one single entity that you can reach out in case there's a situation like this. And that's the agency. And that's what I did. I called you, she called you, and then you were able to bring other interpreters for different events on that day, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. We had to scramble and find extra interpreters for the 2 days, and you weren't available because you'd already also like committed to something in the afternoon because you weren't booked for something in the afternoon with me. So yeah, we had to scramble, but in the end, yeah, the client was super happy that we found interpreters for them to be able to help them out, and she understood too. Like yes, like we'll be generous. The interpreters will be generous with their time, but also you need to respect their time and the working conditions that they're under, right? So yeah, I think that she really did a great job like just being flexible, and it was all thanks to you coming to me as the agency and saying like, here's the problem, let's find a solution. And that's, I think, like kudos to you for doing that.
Well,
And
thank you.
coming back to this one interpreter, that would have been step two after trying to contact your colleague who wasn't showing up, was contact the agency, because the agency should know where your colleague is as well. So the worst thing there is when you're in an assignment is to be in the dark. You don't want these situations where you have to improvise like so drastically, like having to work by yourself all day, or like when sometimes people don't give any documentations to prepare in advance, and you just show up empty-handed. You have no idea what
That's
this
right.
topic is about. So yeah, it's really important from an agency perspective to be able to give the interpreter as many tools as possible to provide a quality service. Like when I first started UN language services, I was like, I do not want to open a fire hall. Like I do not want to be putting out fires left, right, and center. I want everything to be clear on the contract. I want everything to be clear with my client. And if anything deviates from that, we'll find a solution.
Yeah. Sometimes I think that, and I'm not talking about anyone specific here or the case that we were talking about, but I think that generally speaking, I remember when I first started as an interpreter, sometimes you feel, sometimes it's kind of hard to understand the relationship between the interpreter and the agency, because the agency, as a self-employed interpreter like myself, the agency is not your boss,
No.
and it's a partner. There's a
Hmm.
working relationship here, and sometimes I think that newer interpreters are, I would say, like afraid to disappoint. They want to show initiative, which is a good thing, but at the same time, they might bend over backwards for something they shouldn't, in a way that a more experienced interpreter might not.
Yeah. Yeah, like someone who's already had like years of experience and has many clients in many different even countries or whatnot, like they don't have a problem putting their foot down when something is out of line, right? Whereas you're right, like someone who's just new, like, oh my God, like what am I going to do? I don't want to the agency, like to put my back against to the agency. I don't want to disappoint this client, and I'm stuck in this limbo where I don't know what to do. So Yeah, I don't like I said like the I wish I had like the magic solution, but I think it's a case by case scenario, and I think you do have to have safeguards before you accept an assignment to be able to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen. Like contact with your colleagues, contact with the agency. Um, a lot of
I think
times
you were
agencies.
telling me that I think you were telling me that every clause in your contract, you added it after something bad happened, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. Like even like overtime, like you have to specify their interpreters will work 8 hours. After that, there's overtime. Like it's not like it's a flat
When you
rate,
count the
but
8 hours, is it like with breaks or without breaks, or what do you mean by like what's
uh,
8 hours?
well, it depends. But usually, yeah, like 9 to 5, 8 hours. Like if there's
Okay,
an hour lunch and two 15-minute breaks, it's part like you can't do
it's
anything
part of the
other
eight
than
hours.
be there. Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's the same as in most workplaces, anyways. And um, yeah, so basically, like I said, like if you have this contract, luckily for me, I was an interpreter before I owned an agency, so a lot of shit happened to me before beforehand too, and I was like, oh, I don't want this to happen to someone else. So that's kind of where I drafted the contract from, like just basically like let's make sure that any additional fees are there, that there's no like secrets, like if someone's recording you, like that's out in the open, that if you're going to be like showing up on YouTube next week, that's in the clause, like you're going to be
Yeah.
paid
How do
extra
how
for
do you
that
deal with the
because
record? How do you deal with the recording? Because since the pandemic, sometimes we're surprised. I was surprised once to see myself on YouTube without knowing.
I know, yeah, and it happens. But like, yeah, when I set up my contract with my clients, I do put like if there will be additional fees if this happens, so they are aware of them. So at least there's that. But yeah, like I said, there's a lot of agencies that just send an email out and say this is what we're offering, take it or leave it. And yeah, and I think that's dangerous. Like the other thing that is uh, that I got burned with when I was a freelancer was no cancellation policy. So like you get canceled the day
Right.
before, and you're like, okay, well now I have no income the next day because I'm not going to be able to find something overnight to replace this. So then you end up with zero income, right? So it's important to have that cancellation policy and for it to be fair for both parties. Like you want to give the client enough time to be able to cancel in case nobody needs the service, but at the same time, you need to give the interpreter an opportunity to be able to find something else so they're not um, making $0 on any particular day. Like if usually like with people like say if you work for the government, like your meeting gets canceled, you're still getting paid for that day, but the interpreters are not. So it's important for them to be
Even you,
protected, right?
when you're sick, even when you're sick, you get paid.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
don't.
yeah. No, we're all subcontractors, so we rely on each contract that we get to be able to make a living and feed our families. So yeah,
But
so it's
how do you deal
important.
with? But on your end, I mean, for instance, if let's say there's 1 week planned, or maybe it's just even or either one day or a week. But I mean, it must be hard sometimes to tell the client, listen, you've canceled before. What's your policy? 5 or 3 days or 5 days?
5 business days.
All right, so
Yeah,
5 business days. You've canceled under 5 business days. I'm going to charge you the full rate for the team of 2 or 3 interpreters, depending on how long the gig was,
yeah.
depending on how many days. And aren't you afraid on your side to lose a client? Or sometimes you just don't invoice the client and just to pay the interpreters. How do you deal with that?
It depends. Like sometimes it's if it's me, I'll be flexible and I'll be like, okay, well, listen, I know that this is canceled. If you want to reschedule, let's see if I'm free, and then we can make up for the difference that way. But most of the time, like
So
they do.
you would pay the interpreter, and then you would take over and you would do the gig instead of the interpreter that was scheduled to compensate the
No,
client.
let's say if I was scheduled to do the interpretation and then
Okay.
it got canceled, I'm like, okay, well, I'm getting paid a salary through my company, so like if I can be a little bit more flexible if it's me personally, but if it's one of my colleagues, I'm like, I'm sorry, but you have to pay my colleague, and it's already in their contract anyways that they need to pay it. So I'm not
Yeah,
I'm not
but you
really
know how
too
it is
worried.
with
It
contracts.
it's
Sometimes clients are like, "Yeah, I know I signed a contract, but let's talk." Right? People
I
always
know,
try.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But
It's
I mean, I don't
frustrating,
know.
but that's
I've
what
been
happens.
Yeah, I've been pretty lucky though. Like I gotta say, in like 21 years that I've had different agencies and I've been a freelancer, I've hardly ever come across someone who refuses to pay. Like it's
Really?
yeah, even like
But aren't you afraid you might lose the client, or you might like offend the client, and the client will say, "Oh, you know what? I'm going to go elsewhere next time."
maybe, but like usually like my clients are repeat clients, so like they understand and they've also like I mean they need to look at what they're signing as well, right? Like they're not going to blindly
Hmm.
sign a contract. So if the cancellation is set in stone, then that's basically what it is. Now, like I said, if it's if I can offer some flexibility, I will, but I'm not going to do it to jeopardize someone's source of income.
Yeah, because as an interpreter, sometimes, especially when you're, I remember when I first started as an interpreter, and then there was a cancellation, and I was, to be honest with you, when I first started, I was a bit afraid of invoicing
Hmm.
because I was like, oh, am I just going to invoice for the like the event that has not happened? Should I book myself if I have another offer? Should I say so and not invoice it? Or, there are a lot of questions in mind. And I think that when you're starting, you're it's inevitable that at some point you'll be faced with some of these issues, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's those three things that you don't talk about with people that you've just met, right? Like the religion and money and politics. I think are the three that you don't.
Politics.
And so, like, you have to talk money with someone an agency
Next
that
week,
you've
we'll
just met.
talk about
Yes,
the American election, the influence of religion on it, and we'll talk about money. Come next
that's
week.
right. Stay tuned. So yeah, so unfortunately you're meeting this new agency and you got to talk about one of those three things, which is money, right? So, and it is a little bit uncomfortable, but yeah, and especially if like the things changed. Like if you're asking for overtime because you had to work an extra 3 4 hours, or if you're being recorded and that wasn't stated. So like yeah, it's a little awkward, but I would say don't worry about it because the client's getting paid, so you're going to get paid as well. So I would just my one thing, the pet peeve that I have is when people invoice like a month later. So like my suggestion
Oh,
is make sure you get your books are in order immediately. Like just like if something happens, inform the agency immediately and tell them, listen, like this is how it is. Let me know how to invoice. And always put the ball back in their court and see what they come back with.
okay.
But do it
But
quickly.
and it's also better to talk maybe even over the phone beforehand, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, a quick phone call also will solve it instead of having it an email. But if you want a paper trail, if you're nervous about that,
Right.
then email is always good too.
Yeah,
And
totally right.
yeah, and also like the other thing with our job is that sometimes we have to travel places, so it's good to be clear beforehand. This is the mileage it is from my house to this place. This is how much, um, or this is how much a hotel would cost, or a plane would cost, a flight, or taxis. Like, just make sure
Yeah,
that
as
you're
long as you
not.
don't end up in the wrong city.
That's right. Yeah, that's another story for another podcast. So,
Yeah.
but in any event, you and I both know what we're talking about. But
Also, no, no.
yes, we will soon enough. So yeah, no, but it's good to know that beforehand, like all of your out of pocket expenses when you're traveling are going to be covered. So like that's another thing that we a good warning for new interpreters coming into the business. You shouldn't have any out of pocket expenses when you're traveling.
So we're talking about kilometers.
Yep, mileage
Okay.
and flights. Usually,
Yeah.
flights are organized by the client, but sometimes you may have to. And hotels as well. Usually it's organized by
Yeah.
the client. And taxis, if you have to get from an airport to a hotel or something like that.
Per
And
diem, rest for
and a per
restaurants.
diem, yeah, for restaurants or anything that any out of pocket expense that you have. I always give a per diem to interpreters, but I never ask them what they're going to use it for. I always assume it's for food. But when I started, you forget your cell phone charger, you forget this, you forget that, you need soap, you need toothpaste, like whatever. Like there's always a little something here and there that you don't have at home that you might need.
And
So
you always charge it to the client after.
yeah, yeah, that's always negotiated with the client, and then you always give the same to the interpreters. So like, say you ask the client like the per diem is going to be like $75 or something like that, and
With
um,
inflation, it should get, maybe it increases a bit every year, or
yeah,
has it?
let's say
Probably.
yeah, that's or like if you want to use a round number, $100. So
Okay.
the agency charges the client $100, and then the interpreter charges the agency $100 to get that per diem. Yeah. So you like again, like you said, like some people worry about invoicing, but if it's all laid out in the contract and this is what it is, then and you have receipts to back it up too, not necessarily for the meals, but for the taxis, and if you have to pay flights or whatever, just keep all your receipts just in case.
That is a very good advice. Keep all of your receipts. What I do is, I've got Dropbox on my cell phone, and then I just load the app and I scan the receipt. I put it in a folder so everything's in order.
Awesome. And like I said, like there's a lot of people who wait to invoice. I would do it right away. Even just a picture of the receipt, and then you send that along with your invoice. Just makes it quick.
Yeah, because you have to wait for the interpreter's invoice before you send your own invoice, right?
That's right. So let's say like there's a team of 3 interpreters working, and then 2 of them send their invoices right away, but there's a third one who I know has travel expenses, but it takes them like 2 weeks to get back to me with all of their receipts. These interpreters who invoice right away are going to have to wait that extra 2 weeks because of this one interpreter, the third one, right? So, and then I can then invoice the client, but then that takes a while, right? So you're extending the time that it would take to be able to get paid. And at the end of the day, where this isn't like we're doing this for not just because we love interpretation. Like I can there's no we wouldn't be having a podcast about interpretation
Well,
if we didn't
yeah,
love
exactly.
interpretation.
I was gonna say exactly that. I wouldn't be here talking for an hour about interpretation if did not absolutely love it.
Yes, absolutely. So then, so yeah, so we also need to make a living. So yeah, it's important. Just be considerate of how you would want things to happen, and then try to apply that to invoicing or anything else.
Yeah, you have to
Another.
be. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was gonna switch topics, but yeah, I guess we could do that, right?
What
Did
did
we?
what did you have in mind?
Oh, I was thinking about other things like confidentiality. Like that's a
Right.
huge thing too. Like we're privy to a lot of information. Like the way that I see interpretation is that
That we're
there's
going to reveal all over this
this
podcast.
the,
That's why we're doing a podcast to reveal
all the secrets,
everything that we hear, all the
all the
secrets.
secrets from
We
these flies
know.
on the wall. So the way that I see things, there's about 10% of the population that meets to have conferences and discuss different things. And then they use that, and then 90% of the rest of the population has to kind of follow whatever law was written or whatever policy was drafted, like all these things, right? So it takes about 10% of the population to basically tell the other 90% this is how things are going to be. And
This
we
is how
are, as
sad it is.
interpreters, we are not in that position to do that, but we have to convey that message to the people who don't understand one another. So we are technically the flies in the wall, right?
That's
And
right.
so yeah, so the confidentiality is huge. It's super important. You can't go out and blab about what you said. So like, make sure that even though it's like it's not, it has to be set in stone, basically, like with your agency, like there has to be a confidentiality clause.
Yeah, that's one
And
thing that actually surprises me. Sometimes people say, "Oh, you must have signed an NDA for this," and I'm like, "No, I haven't." I mean, with you, I do often sign one, but sometimes with other agencies, I'm like, "No, no, this was very delicate information." Sometimes I'm in my car and I hear people on the radio shouting at whatever's going on, and I'm like, I know something you don't know, and I know why the government has made that decision, and I cannot call the radio station to tell them what I know. Although I had not signed an NDA, I I'm holding myself, and I decide not to reveal important information.
Yeah, I think it's like part of your basic code of ethics as a human being not to.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like it should, like if you're working with an agency, it should be set in stone. Yeah, no, like no blabbing about anything that you hear. So like,
Only
yeah,
with your booth partner.
I know, yeah, because you guys are both in the know. But like last week, I was at a conference and they announced that they were going to lay off 150 employees.
Ah,
So,
wow.
which sucks. I hate those kinds
Yeah,
of
I
conferences
know.
where there's something negative and there's nothing to, hey, look on the bright side. No, there is no bright side. This is what's happening. So, yeah, you get put into those situations, but again, confidentiality is key. As much as you want to say these things to people, and as much as you think, even in other cases where you think it's completely unfair, this is not according to my values or my beliefs, then yeah, it's important to keep that those lips sealed.
Does it often happen to you to spend the whole day saying things you don't really, I mean, you don't really, or you don't believe at all, or they're that are the exact opposite of what you would say? I find that this is actually one of the hardest thing about our job, is to say things that are not your own.
Hmm.
Think about it. You spend your whole life, whenever you speak, you spend your whole life being yourself and saying what you believe. But we have to, it's kind of hard sometimes mentally, I think, to spend your day saying the opposite, or, close to the opposite of what you believe in. And it doesn't have to be like this racist speech, or
Yeah.
whatever. It doesn't have to be that. But like I remember when last year, during the same week, I had a pro Palestinian speech, and then the following day I had a pro Israel speech.
Hmm.
And and I was like, well, if I had to analyze and think about it and reflect on it, I was basically sometimes saying the exact opposite of one another. Not to say that, like everyone, I would have an opinion about it, but sometimes I was like, did I really just say that?
Hmm.
On one side, and then the other, I'm like, oh, did I really just say that? And sometimes I think, oh, I must have misheard something. And whatever the topic, doesn't have to be politics or anything. But and then later on, the point is being explained, and I realize, I'm like, oh, gladly I didn't screw up. That person really said that, but I did really say that. I can't believe
Also,
what I just
yes.
said.
Yeah, sometimes it really sucks to be Switzerland, because that's our position. Like we're neutral, right? Like this is what we have to be. Like we have to convey the message as accurately as possible, whether we believe it or not. That's
Yeah,
part
that's
of
right.
our job as interpreters. And yeah, as a new interpreter, you might think, oh, well, maybe like no, like this is not what I believe in, but unfortunately, whether you believe in this or not, you have to interpret it as faithfully as possible. Even if it's you don't believe it, it's not like your religious values or your code of ethics. Like you still have to do your job basically when
Yeah.
you're on
Do you
site.
believe that makes us more open-minded or more close-minded over the years? You've met a lot of experienced interpreters, because
Yeah,
imagine you spend. I mean, we're still relatively young, but I imagine after a long career, um, how I wonder how some people uh, end up. I mean, maybe they wouldn't have ended up the same way because they've been seeing and saying so many things over the years. But to be honest with you, I meet sometimes, no names, but older interpreters that are more on the extremes. And I wonder, maybe they weren't born that way, but they happen to be that way after spending their lives saying other people's stuff.
yeah. I mean that's totally possible. Like if you spend your entire career up on Parliament Hill interpreting for politicians, then you're gonna be set on a certain in a certain path, right? Like, and I always make fun of Ottawa because every time I bump into someone, they're always saying something that has to do with politics. And I'm like, oh my god, like, can we talk about something different, or just like leave Ottawa for like a little while? You'll notice that there are other topics of conversation. But But yeah, no, I think the people, yeah, will end up getting set on their ways because of what they hear. So I guess coming back to our theme of being a new interpreter, just be wary of that, and that, never be like complacent. Like never be like, oh man, not this topic again and again, and you can hear it in your voice. It's like you're kind of bored of the subject that's come up so many times. Like no, always have that fire in your belly when you're interpreting. Like always,
That's right.
yeah, like never be like, oh, you know what, like this sucks. I've like this guy said the same thing like 50 times. I can't believe I'm gonna do this again. Like no, get that out of your mind. Do your job. Like that's basically what I would tell new interpreters too. Like and be
Do you
careful of
hear
that
some
because it
apathy?
can happen.
Do you hear some apathy sometimes from interpreters?
Yeah, I think that's the word that I was looking for. I think is a lot of people like they get apathy. They're like, "Oh, I've already done this for so many years, and we're still talking about it." And yeah, you can hear the apathy in their voice, but like really, like for some people that are at a conference, this is the first time that they've heard about this. So like you're still trying to get the message across as faithfully as possible, and having that apathy in the like in that you can hear in someone's voice, it's not something that I would like to hear if in my own voice. And I hope I never become that way where I will have apathy for certain subjects. And if I do, Alain, you could just smack me across the head and say, "Hey, remember that our second podcast that we ever had when you said this?" I'm like, "Yep, sorry, I'll
No,
behave."
the first thing that I'll say is, "Hey, I was free on that day."
Yeah, I could have done it with less apathy. Yep. Yeah. No. Here we are.
Yeah,
Mark this date. So one other thing that I would like to maybe finish up on, it's not a big deal,
sure.
but it's just the way you look when you're at a conference, like especially in person.
I
Like
do not dress like this at a conference. Don't worry.
yeah, exactly. Like we're on
Just for
Zoom
podcast.
here or whatever. Like yeah, yeah. Like we don't even know if we're wearing pants at this point. But like I would say, like if you're at a conference, like try to look professional. I know it's common sense, but I've seen a lot of people show up in jeans and a t-shirt.
No
So
way.
yeah, I've seen people like all kinds of different things, right? Like so yeah, just try to be professional with your colleague, be courteous to your colleague. Don't like I've had situations where an interpreter didn't know me and I was new to the business and that interpreter just had a newspaper, put it in front of uh, her like this and like stopped talking to me during breaks. Just was like there was a physical barrier between us so we wouldn't be able to communicate. So like
Wow.
yeah, no, I've seen it all. I'm telling you. So, like, yeah, professional conduct, like, just be courteous towards your colleagues, be courteous to the client, even if things aren't going your way, even if the sound isn't ideal. Like, be courteous to the technicians who are, trying to give you the best sound as possible. Be courteous to the staff at the hotel or at the venue who are bringing you water and making sure that you're comfortable and turning the AC up and down according to whoever's cold and whoever's hot. And you can never please everybody. Like, they've got a lot of stuff on their plates. And also like the people who manage events, like hats off. I would never be able to be an event planner. Like so much time and dedication to that profession, and they're dealing with 1,001 things. The last thing they want to hear is, oh, the interpreter is not getting proper sound, or the interpreter isn't this. That's what the agency is for. And think about that too when you've got multiple teams, because like uh, earlier this week I did a conference and there were 24 interpreters at this conference.
Wow.
So imagine like half of them. They're like, "Oh, we don't get good sound. Let's contact the client." All of a sudden, this client has 12 emails, and she's like, "What do I do? Like I've already got all this stuff to do. I've got to deal with this person. I got to make reservations for this restaurant tonight. I got to do this." So like, no, everything like you said at the beginning of this podcast, always talk to the agency first.
That's right. Well, that's a pretty good word of advice. So whatever happens, talk to the agency and make sure you have a contract so things are clear. And if some
Absolutely.
people from agencies are actually listening to this podcast someday, somehow, well, make sure you've got a good contract because it helps everyone, right?
Absolutely. And have a
Ask
easy.
ChatGPT for a few clauses. It's easy.
Absolutely. Yeah. ChatGPT does wonders these days. We'll talk about AI in another podcast
Yeah,
for
that's
sure.
right. Yes, yes, yes.
But for the time
All
being, I
right, my
hope this
friend.
was helpful. And
Yeah.
yeah, what else? Any final Words of wisdom?
Well, you know what? I can't wait, not for next year for that exam, but I can't wait for next week to meet you again for another podcast.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to that. Let's end on that good
Uh,
note.
all right. Take care.
Later.
Bye.